Today is an odd one, as we have a card that to the general public doesn't exist, the RTX 5050, a card that, while it falls under the 50 series group of products, has some major differences that on face value comes across that NVIDIA, along with many mainstream AIB partners, didn't even want to show it. That's why you'll find a severe lack of content on the card, including all-important reviews. The big question, however, is why that's the case? What's being hidden, or are we just looking at a card that is maybe a little bit misunderstood and shouldn't just be judged on its 8GB of GDDR6 memory and lackluster specs? At $249, it's an interesting argument, as this is one of the cheapest NVIDIA cards we've seen for a while, and could be a rival to the all-important market that Intel have been slowly swallowing up as of late. And with nothing at this price point from AMD, it's an interesting move by the Green team. But if it's anything like the RTX 3050 was when that launched, being, well, pretty dead on arrival as an RTX-based card, then we could have history repeating itself. But as always, I'm humble enough that I'll happily eat my own words. And, well, that's where the all-important benchmarks come in to see exactly what the lay of the land is and how the card stacks up. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video sponsor.
Alright, stay calm. You've got one job. Do not let this thing overheat.
It's running hot. I don't know if it's safe.
Get the WireView Pro.
The WireView Pro safeguards your graphics card with real-time power and temperature monitoring, acoustic alarms for custom thresholds, and sensor pin detection to ensure proper 12V PWR connection. External sensors can monitor additional components like memory or voltage regulators, while an OLED display provides instant insights, meaning that this is the last time you'll blow a 12V PWR connector, soldier. To keep your system protected, click the link in the description below.
So let's quickly discuss the market because, again, it's an odd one. NVIDIA's lowest price card until now was the RTX 5060, an 8GB card that launched for $299. And in all honesty, not just from ourselves, but it wasn't what I'd call best received. And that really came down to one key thing, 8GB of memory on a 128-bit bus. But it came with a difference, because at least it utilised GDDR7 memory to leverage some higher bandwidth. There were games like Indiana Jones and the Great Circle and Doom Eternal, to name a few, showcasing the issues that 8GB of VRAM makes in 2025. The RTX 5050 is already starting on the back foot, especially given that NVIDIA have plumped for GDDR6 instead, leading to a pretty measly, at least in the grand scheme of things, 320GB a second of bandwidth. Comparing that to what AMD have, it's very much the same. That features the same GDDR6 memory and uses the same 128-bit interface. So very similar in terms of bandwidth. And while AMD and their partners didn't want to send out the 8GB model for review, us and other reviewers made our own conclusions based on the 16GB model. And again, we saw the 8GB variant dead on arrival. So you're probably starting to see a bit of a trend with these cards, and it all comes down to, well, the memory. 8GB isn't enough, but why? Well, when the RTX 30 series launched, some cards had 8GB of VRAM and, well, no one complained. So what's changed? Yes, it was a different time, and kind of as we take a trip down memory lane, no one really batted an eyelid. So again, what has changed? Well, in all honesty, a lot comes down to the consumer. And sorry, but I'm going to blame you guys to a degree. We as gamers have been a little bit spoiled, that now it's almost expected or a given to be able to run the latest games on max settings, even if at a lower resolution. It's almost unacceptable to have anything less. And with higher settings generally having larger textures or ray tracing baked in, much like we see on games like Indiana Jones, which is a culprit of this, it just doesn't fit the bill. And, well, that leads to issues. Now, there is a caveat to all of this, and that comes down to price. If AMD, Intel, or even NVIDIA release a card that is below par in the court of public opinion, as long as the price stacks up, then there is a saving grace. And until now, well, we've not really had that. Whereas the RTX 5050, coming in at $249, just scrapes into that margin that could see it considered as a worthy contender in the more budget-focused space. Not only content on butchering the memory design on this card though, NVIDIA have also plumped for using the PCIe 5.0 X8 interface, whereas cards like the 9060 XT, even in its 8GB form, uses X16 bandwidth, and is only $50 more. So I guess there's more angles to take kind of this whole situation from. But our focus is, well, on how this GB207 based GPU performs in all of the latest games, if we can get them running at all. Now, while we did reach out to a lot of AIB partners to get a card, as mentioned, they were somewhat reluctant, though Colourful came to the rescue with their Ultra W Duo OC model. And while we will have some more content specific to this model and its cooling capabilities, along with breaking down the card to look at the design and quality, today is all about that GB207 300A1 core, a core that is only actually used on the 5050 series, including mobile, and then the equivalent RTX Pro models. Now, this particular model does improve on the stock clock speeds by increasing the boost clock by around 3% from 2572 MHz up to 2647, which in all honesty isn't a huge amount, but this is done through the one key overclock button on the rear, which again we'll be looking at in a separate review. Well, we actually stuck with the stock clock, so our results will be pretty typical of what most RTX 5050 models will be like. Now, to test the RTX 5050, we threw it onto our GPU benchmark system with an AMD Ryzen 7 9800X 3D processor and 32GB of Corsair Vengeance RGB 6000MHz CL30 memory on a Gigabyte B650E Aorus Master motherboard. All of our testing was done on the latest version of Windows with the latest updates, and for our testing, we used the NVIDIA 576.88 Game Ready driver. Now, due to the specs and the pricing of this card and where kind of NVIDIA are positioning it, we will be putting our focus on 1080p today because, well, 4K is going to be out of reach and 1440p is more geared towards the 5060 and 5060 Ti class of cards. Also, if you're wondering why we didn't compare this to Intel, namely the B580, which comes in with the same launch price, then, well, you'd have to talk to Intel, as it comes across that they seem to refuse to send us a card after, well, many broken promises, though we're doing our utmost to procure one ourselves for future comparisons, so watch this space. Maybe we'll do a head-to-head or something. So, with that out of the way, let's get into those glorious benchmarks. First up is a Plague Tale, and the 5050 comes in bottom of our standings, with 18% less performance than the aging RTX 3060 Ti, and 27% behind its bigger brother, the RTX 5060 8GB, and also shows that 2 years later, and a $50 haircut, that is comparative to the RTX 4060, which, in all honesty, isn't a great look. In Alawake 2, the RTX 5050 just misses the mark if you're looking to play at 1080p on the high preset, coming in at 57 FPS, which nigh on matches the RTX 4060 identically, and shows that by spending a little more, for instance for the 9060 XT, you can net yourself another 74% more performance for 40% more cash. Moving over to Baldur's Gate 3, and again, the 5050 isn't looking great. Sure, it gives us playable frame rates at 1080p on ultra settings, though it's not that demanding in terms of GPU performance anyway. But it paints a better picture as to the generational improvements compared to the RTX 4060, or should I say, the lack thereof, as it sits 11% behind the Ada Lovelace-based card. In Black Myth Wukong, the RTX 5050 finally starts to move up our charts, sitting 4% ahead of the RX 7600 XT, but again coming in matching the RTX 4060's performance at 51 FPS. Though it does, I guess, improve on the 1% lows, where the Ada-based cards seem to have some issues, and retesting did garner the same result. Dialing settings in could help you to bring performance up, but it still feels like a bit of a hollow victory when we think about, I guess, that all-important gen-on-gen improvements. In Counter-Strike 2, the RTX 5050 comes in 7% faster than the RX 7600 XT, which shows, I guess, that VRAM isn't everything, considering this new Blackwell-based GPU comes packing half the amount. What is sad to see, though, is that there is no tangible difference for the most part between this card, the 3060 Ti, and the RTX 4060 in the averages, as they all fall within a few percent of each other. Though, to not be overly critical, the 1% lows are much better here, so at least there's a silver lining. Moving over to Cyberpunk, the RTX 5050 is actually starting to, well, look pretty decent and well worth the money. It's here where we find the 5050 actually rubbing shoulders with its bigger brother, the RTX 5060, separated by a single FPS in both the averages and the 1% lows, and sitting 34% ahead of the RTX 4060 from last generation, and even coming in 5% faster than the 4060 Ti. If we start to see more results like this, we could actually be onto a winner. Sadly, we don't, because as we move over to F124, the RTX 5050 is back on the bottom of our charts, coming in with 162 FPS, which again puts it behind the RTX 4060, which again doesn't feel like it's enough, as a next generation card coming in with 12% less performance almost shows us why NVIDIA didn't sample this card in the first place. I get that the RTX 4060 came in $50 more expensive at launch, but well, we're 2 years on, and this is essentially the lowest tier card of the 50 series against the lowest tier card from the 40 series. Now, Indiana Jones is an interesting one because it scored precisely 0. Not because it performed so badly, but because it simply didn't run. For anyone who's played the game, you'll know that the menu forms part of the game, and well, with this card, we couldn't even get into it. This is actually a common occurrence we've seen with 8GB cards, and well, the only way to save it is to drop the texture pool size right down, which we could have done, though then it would make, I guess, this comparative test unfair. So it's easier to give it a did not finish, or in this case, a did not even start. Again, if you hadn't guessed by now, the RTX 5050 hugs the bottom of our chart again in Starfield, sitting below that 60 FPS threshold that most gamers crave, and falling 16% behind the RTX 4060, though the averages are definitely improved on the newer card, which will certainly help in the dips and lead to smoother gameplay experiences overall. But seeing above 60 FPS would have been, I guess, nice and would have at least given a talking point and something to use for marketing. Then in War Thunder, it's much of the same again. The RTX 5050 sits narrowly behind the RTX 4060, sitting at a 5% margin behind. And while it's enough to beat out the RX 7600 XT, I think gamers are just expecting more for their money. And looking at how this performed across the board and the other 8GB cards there, it's definitely showing that the lack of VRAM is holding this and other cards back. Across the 10 games tested, the RTX 5050 comes in with an average FPS of 127, which puts it 6% behind the RTX 4060, a card that is, well, 2 years old, and while it did launch for $299 compared to the $249 price tag of this card, I feel that we've not really moved on from where things are, or have been. This also puts the 5050 14% behind the RTX 3060 Ti, an 8GB card that launched nearly 5 years ago. Admittedly for a lot more money, but again this starts to paint a picture as to kind of where things are in terms of generational improvements, if any. To play devil's advocate, the RTX 5050 did score 0 in Indiana Jones, so removing that result for both the RTX 5050 and RTX 4060 does give us a slightly different result in the averages. Though again, not much has changed, as instead of the RTX 5050 being 6% behind, it's now 4% behind. But at this point, it almost feels like I'm trying to make excuses for the card, but well, that's not my intention at all. Being an RTX card, maybe things start looking better in ray tracing based titles, and kicking things off with Alan Wake 2, which, as a caveat, has got upscaling set to balanced, because even on higher tiered cards, it's a necessity. It's here where the RTX 5050 is looking promising. Not only do we see it moving up our standings, but we also see it scrape past the 60 FPS threshold, coming in at 61 frames per second. But this also means it comes in 5% faster than the RTX 4060. Not a huge uplift, but, well, it's something, and other titles may see larger improvements. Sadly, in Black Myth Wukong, that's just not the case, and it comes in as the worst performing RTX card that we've tested for these results, matching the performance of the RTX 3060 Ti and falling 2 FPS behind the RTX 4060. The silver lining is that it does come in faster than the 9060 XT and even higher end cards from the last 2 generation of AMD GPUs, but that's more of a testament as to how bad they were and not how good this is. Cyberpunk's rasterization performance was pretty good, but enabling ray tracing sees that performance plummet. And again, this feels very similar to what the RTX 3050 felt like when that was released. Almost like it should have never been an RTX card, and instead, NVIDIA should have brought back the GTX branding, or just not bothered to release the card at all. Lastly, in F124, we do see the RTX 5050 come in with 61 FPS, which is perfectly fine, but again, sitting at the bottom of our charts makes it feel mediocre. Especially again when compared to the likes of the RTX 4060. This card should, well, not only be matching its performance, but surpassing it, even if by a small margin. Otherwise, this just feels like an RTX 4060 Lite, or 2.0, or 1.1 maybe even for that matter. Now, looking at the ray tracing averages at 1080p, and I think it was pretty clear to see that again, much like rasterization, it falls short. Not only do we find the RTX 5050 sitting 5% behind the RTX 4060, but the margin behind the 3060 Ti stays pretty strong at 13%, with the only saving grace being that ray tracing performance was so bad on the 7600 XT that at least NVIDIA come in faster than something by a pretty impressive 20%. Again though, through fault of AMD and not through the strength of NVIDIA on this occasion. So how do things look with the all-important cost per frame? Because while the performance wasn't amazing, this could be the bold difference that puts the RTX 5050 in a completely different light due to its $249 price tag. It's here where MSRP actually doesn't come out too bad, comparatively speaking. The RTX 5050 comes in with cost per frame of $1.96, which puts it 10 cents more expensive per frame than the 9060 XT. So all looks okay. But it's very hard to ignore the 32% slower performance overall. It's, $100 more expensive, granted, but also comes in with an extra level of longevity due to the 16 gig of VRAM. Though, if budget constraints were an important factor, the RTX 5060 comes in the best value at $1.81 per frame. But even then, I wouldn't really recommend that, and instead would steer you towards, again, the RX 9060 XT. It's a funny game of spend $50 more, get a bit more, spend another $50 more and get a bit more again. And while the 9060 XT is more expensive, it's hard to deny that 16 gig is the new normal, especially if you want to play games like Indiana Jones and similar, where you either get issues before the game runs, or you get lackluster performance when actually in game. Now, in terms of real-world selling prices though, things look even worse for the RTX 5050. Not only is it, seeing the 5060 as the better buy, the RX 9060 XT does fall behind, but we're talking a single cent per frame, but for 60 FPS more on average. That's a bit of a no-brainer considering what you get for the money, not just in terms of performance, but the whole package, double VRAM and all. Now, I mentioned at the start that we have the Duo OC model from Colourful. Now, with the RTX 5050, there is no reference model or founder's card, so instead, NVIDIA are relying on their AIB partners to bring cards to market. And of course, you'll be expected to see MSRP cards, along with slightly more premium models, coming in with slightly higher price points, generally $20 or so. This model being the Duo, and the fact that Colourful have a triple fan version too, this one is their MSRP offering. So if retailers play ball, you'll be expected to see this at the $249 price tag that it's supposed to be. That aside, we obviously want to see how things do under a sustained level of load. And it's here where under an hour-long loop of F124 on the max settings, we found temperatures remained under control. Both the GPU and the memory temperature remain pretty consistent, sitting around 61 degrees on both, with a fan speed at a very reasonable 1,354 RPM. While I'm under no illusion that the triple fan version would perform even better, I don't think anyone would be upset by those numbers and, how quiet the operation would be. Power-wise, the card used just under 130 watts of power, showing that the card is quite efficient in the grand scheme of things, and for the most part during a long session sat under that 130 watt TDP of the GPU core. In terms of clock speeds, the GPU clock hovered around the 2,925 MHz mark for the most part, while the memory consistently stayed at its rated 2,500 MHz, or 20 gigabit per second effective speed. So this is a card that right from the start just felt a bit odd. And after putting it through its paces, it's clear why. This isn't a flagship, and it's not even going to be setting any mid-range records, but at its $249 MSRP, it steps into a market that genuinely needs a bit of attention from NVIDIA. And, purely on performance, the RTX 5050 doesn't exactly offer that next-gen jump that we're usually looking for. Across our 10-game rasterization tests, it was slower than the RTX 4060, a card that is now 2 years old. Then, when you compare it to the 3060 Ti, a card that's nearly 5 years old, it's even more noticeably behind. Yeah, removing the did not run Indiana Jones result, I guess changes things, but it just then feels like we're trying to make excuses for what is fundamentally just a lack of progress. Moving on to ray tracing, which is usually NVIDIA's strong point, the story here is pretty much the same. Alan Wake 2 did show a promising lead over the RTX 4060, but that was one game, and it had upscaling on. But then overall, it just ended up behind the 4060 again, and then even further behind the 3060 Ti. I don't know, it just kind of makes you question if you should even have the RTX badge on this. Maybe bringing back the GTX branding or just simply not releasing the card at all would have actually, been a clearer message. Now, the big one obviously comes down to pricing. And at $249, the 5050 initially looked like it could be NVIDIA's answer for the budget market, especially with AMD not really having anything at this exact price point. But our cost per frame shows that on paper, yes, it isn't terrible, but here's the kicker. It's 10 cents more expensive per frame than the 9060 XT, yet it gives you 32% less overall performance. And while that is a tough pill to swallow, especially when you think about the longevity that that card gives you in terms of VRAM, especially when, you're looking at games like Indiana Jones, where it just flat out refuses to run on 8 gig cards. And that's a sticking point. Let's be honest though, the big question mark always hangs over real world selling prices, and we mentioned how hard it was to even get our hands on a 5050 for a review. And well, it's the same story with an 8GB RX 9060 XT. If NVIDIA and their AIB partners aren't keen on sending out samples, same with AMD, that pretty much tells you all you need to know. The reality is, if we had an 8GB 9060 XT, things would actually look worse for this card, as that card should come in much closer to its 16GB sibling, which would then just push this even further down. Adding to that, the PCIe 5.0 X8 interface on this compared to the X16 on the 9060 XT, even in its potential 8GB form, is just another limitation that just screams cost cutting. While this particular model that we tested was well behaved for temps and power efficiency and all that good stuff, running quietly and cool under load, the core performance from NVIDIA in terms of the GPU core just isn't there to make this look like a standout product. Ultimately, what is clear is that NVIDIA with the RTX 5050, they just seem to be focusing on hitting a price point rather than truly innovating or offering a big generational upgrade at the entry level. While they push AI upscaling with DLSS, which I'm sure this will perform amazingly in, comparatively speaking, I don't know, it's just when you look at AMD's approach with the 9060 XT, where they're focused on strong raster performance and improved ray tracing at a competitive price with plenty of VRAM, it just sounds more aligned with what gamers need in 2025, whereas this is just struggling for relevance and longevity. So there we have it. For now, that's going to wrap up this review of the new GeForce RTX 5050 from NVIDIA. Hopefully you enjoyed this one. And we will be doing our utmost to get an 8GB 9060 XT and those all-important Intel cards for comparisons. If you did enjoy this video, then a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And if you love what we do, then you can help support everything that we do by joining the Patreon family. You'll get access to a whole host of goodies, including exclusive behind-the-scenes content, game nights, meetups at the eTeknix offices, and much, much more. The link for all that good stuff is down below. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.